I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's talk from Canada, from Australia, from Patrick, of course, in New York and elsewhere in America. And I particularly wanted to welcome those joining from Puerto Rico, from the Museo de Arte de Ponce, where Flaming June has had her home since the 1960s, and I'm sure we'll learn more about that. Some of you will remember we were very fortunate to be able to borrow Flaming June and show it at Leighton House in 2017, reuniting the painting with the other works that made up Leighton's last submission to the Royal Academy in 1895. And that was followed by a loan from our collections to Puerto Rico. And all of that was a wonderful experience. And we formed very strong ties with our colleagues in Puerto Rico. And so we'd just like to take this opportunity to send them all our best wishes in what has been a challenging time for them there. We borrowed Flaming June in 2017 because it was a moment where we were very keen to raise the profile of Leighton House and to raise a lot of money in order to undertake the project that's currently in hand at the museum. As many of you know, we're doing a major capital refurbishment addressing the additions that were made to Leighton House once it had been converted into a museum in the 20th century. And at the end of that project, we'll have a new lift to provide access for the first time to all parts of the building, a cafe space, a new learning center, new display and exhibition spaces, and we'll have completed the restoration of the building so the elements that were trapped in these later additions have been revealed and restored. So I was there today, and it's really wonderfully exciting to see the progress that's now being made. And while there's still some way to go, we're very optimistic about what the end result will be. The house will probably not reopen until early in next year, and perhaps in September of this year, we'll be able to firm up that opening date, and very much look forward to welcoming you then. So turning to this evening's talk, I'm delighted to introduce two great friends, both personally and of Leighton House. The main speaker, Patrick Monaghan, is a writer based in New York, and I first met Patrick at Leighton House when he was working on a piece for Vanity Fair that coincided with Flaming June's exhibition at the Frick in New York. And he's since become a firm friend and is equally a great friend of the gallery in Puerto Rico, and has so sort of brokered this friendship between us. And Patrick will then be followed by Simon Toll, who is Senior Director in the Old Masters Department at Sotheby's, but of course has worked in the Victorian field with Victorian pictures for a very long time and has written a wonderful book about Herbert Draper, the artist, amongst other things. So he will talk, following Patrick, about the current art market in Leighton and two works in particular. That will be followed by a question and answer session. So as we go through the talks, please do click on the chat button on the toolbar at the base of your screen if you have a question that you would like to put, and they will be read out and we'll do our very best to answer them at the end of the talk. So at that point, I'd like to, again, thank you all for joining and hand over to Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's such a pleasure to be here with Leighton House, with Sotheby's, and of course, with all of you. I guess it's evening time in London, and I hope you're all having a drink or something. It's the afternoon here in New York, and the sun is shining, and I can't think of a better sunny day than to talk about Flaming June. Also, when I heard about the topic that we were going to do today, Leighton Rediscovered, I couldn't imagine a better painting as an example than Flaming June, because it's not only Leighton's most famous painting, it's also one that manages to get discovered and rediscovered over and over throughout its 120-odd year history. This is an example. I pull this out at random from many others, but when you see a fairly recent Vogue magazine cover with an actress like Jessica Chastain dressed as Flaming June, you realize that this is a painting which has transcended not only Victorian art, certainly Victorian art, but has entered a class of pictures which are really sort of universal. And I find that fascinating. And I kind of wanted to take you all through how that happened, the mechanics of how a painting becomes discovered and rediscovered enough times to become an icon, essentially. My journey with Flaming June and really my discovery of Flaming June happened in 2015, which, as Daniel said, that's when Flaming June came to the Frick collection in New York. And I wrote an article in Vanity Fair about the picture. I knew about the painting, I knew about Lord Leighton, but I certainly didn't know everything that happened around it, which since has sort of become a bit of a fascination for me. And it all started at the Frick collection itself. And I found this snapshot just on the internet by chance. And I love it because it captures the exact moment when I really discovered Flaming June. And this is the press preview at the Frick collection. And I had already written my article and I sort of stood in the back of the room. And when the other writers and journalists and photographers asked their questions, I made my way to the front of the room, and I'm there in the blue sort of sweater over my shoulder with the tote bag in the far middle. And I don't know if you can see, but I'm talking to a lady in a gray sleeveless blouse just to the left of me. You can see half of her. And what happened was I was standing right in front of the picture, and I said out loud to the universe in general, "Isn't this the most marvelous painting ever?" And she said, this woman who I didn't know just said, "Yes, and did you read the marvelous article that came out in Vanity Fair today?" I said, "I have to confess, I wrote the marvelous article." She said, "Well, then I have to confess, my grandfather bought the marvelous painting." She said, "My name is Maria Luisa Ferré, and I'm the head of the board of trustees of the Museo de Arte de Ponce, where the painting is today." I said, "What are you doing for lunch?" So we had lunch, and I started to hear about really this extraordinary journey of Flaming June. Of course, it started in London at Leighton House in 1895. And I imagine most of the people who are tuning in today have heard of Lord Leighton, but I tell you a bit about how I see him. And I see him very much through this self-portrait of his in 1880, which is hanging at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. I mean, to me, he's the epitome of a Victorian gentleman artist. You see this lovely brushed, billowing beard and these perfectly tousled curls on his head, and these crimson silk robes of a royal academician, and the medal of a royal academician tucked in the front of it, because of course by this time he was the president of the Royal Academy. This picture, I find the background almost more telling than the foreground, because Leighton chose to show himself in front of a cast of the Parthenon frieze, which both hung in his studio at the time and today, but also speaks to the cosmopolitan that he was and the kind of pan-European classical melange sort of painting, which he excelled at, I would say, better than anyone. And Flaming June is certainly a testament to that. It's also a testament to a school of painting which Leighton exemplified, called aestheticism. And aestheticism had for its motto, art for art's sake. In other words, a picture has no greater meaning than itself. And Flaming June very cleverly expresses that. It's really carefully calibrated. It looks so effortless, but it really is quite carefully calibrated. I mean, looking at the back of the picture, you see this sun-drenched sea in front of the sleeping woman. If you ever have the good fortune of seeing this picture in person, the brush strokes are absolutely animated with impasto, expressing that energy of light that's striking the sea backward and forward. I mean, it's so bright in yellows and whites that you almost have to squint. And then in front, this figure at once totally at rest and on the other hand, totally dynamic on this cool white marble Grecian bench, sheltered by an awning, which you could just see across the top. Now, as I say, she's a figure of absolute repose, and yet her figure begs your eye to sort of spiral and swirl around her toward the center of the picture. I mean, to me, she's like a volcano of color. You go from the outer crimson layers of drapery to the ochre, to the apricot, and then your eye sort of swirls hypnotically, almost in a dream, around her long leg, over her shoulder, over the top of her head, over her other elbow, around her profile, over her chin, up the back of her face, over her forehead, and to the absolute center of the picture, which is her closed eye, which reveals absolutely nothing. This is really what aestheticism, to me, is about in this picture. It reveals all the feeling of a languid summer slumber without any of the facts. But of course, with Flaming June, there are many facts outside the canvas. We know who the model was. Her name was Dorothy Dean. She was Leighton's not only model, but muse and friend for the last 15 years of his life. Leighton nurtured her and helped her to become an actress from a model, and they stayed very close friends, and possibly more. It's not exactly known. But here you can see her really striking profile. You could see why she went on the stage on the right in a photograph, and on the left, the only direct head study for Flaming June, which I must add was itself rediscovered quite recently by Simon Toll, our next speaker, when he found it behind the door of a dressing room in the late Duchess of Roxburgh's house, West Horsley Place. The composition itself is equally calculated and calibrated. Leighton said that it was based on a weary model's pose at the end of a long day, and you can see it happening in this study, which is probably the first direct study for Flaming June. You can see Leighton working out these different poses as Dorothy Dean is sort of slumped in this armchair in the studio, and you can see her moving as your eye moves around this drawing. But of course, for someone like Leighton, who knew the classical world inside and out, he spoke many languages, he had traveled to the Mediterranean, to North Africa, to the Near East, so on. And this whole world was so familiar to him that pose would have conjured a myriad of cognitive associations. Here are three. On the left is Michelangelo's sculpture of Night in the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. In the center, a painting after a lost original by Michelangelo of Leda and the Swan, now in the National Gallery in London. And on the right, a frieze, a relief from the Parthenon in Athens of Nike or Nike, winged victory, tying her sandals. But the thing is, when you look at Flaming June, she's all of those things, and she's not any of those things. She's not Leda with the story of Zeus and the swan attached. She isn't an allegory of night, and she's not a victory figure. She's just a sleeping woman who we see just right up against the picture plane in a world which we can absolutely inhabit. The only hint of specificity in this whole non-specific specificity is an oleander flower, which is dangling over her head in the upper right side of the picture. And for the Victorians, flowers were a language in themselves. I mean, a viewer of 1895, when this picture was painted, would have immediately known that an oleander was poisonous. So to hang a poisonous flower over a sleeping figure implies that maybe the person is dead, Or it might imply that the person is a femme fatale. Or, and this is my favorite explanation, in a letter, Leighton compared the scent of oleander to the scent of apricot. And of course, she's wearing an apricot colored gown. So if that's the case, Leighton is presenting a kind of synesthesia, smelling a color, and giving a whole other level to art for art's sake, and the feelings which a picture can evoke, literally the senses which a picture can evoke inside itself. Flaming June was finished probably in the spring of 1895 and was included with Leighton's submissions to the Royal Academy that year. And as the president, Leighton organized every year something called Show Sunday. And that's what this picture is in Leighton's studio. And by the way, you can see the Parthenon frieze I was talking about in the self-portrait in the upper right corner, in the highest part of the wall where it meets the ceiling. Anyway, these were Leighton's 6 submissions to the Royal Academy that year. And on Show Sunday, he would invite the great and the good to preview them, essentially. The problem is that in this whole elegant, cosmopolitan, rarefied world, there were already signs that it was crumbling. I mean, more or less at the same time as this picture was taken, and as Leighton was inviting his circle of artists, the Prince and Princess of Wales, Royal Academicians, so on and so forth, Paul Cézanne was having his first solo exhibition of pre-Cubist paintings at Ambroise Volart's gallery in Paris. In London, within months of this, Oscar Wilde was in the midst of his indecency trial. And Leighton himself was suffering from angina pectoris, which would kill him early in 1896. So in many ways, I see Flaming June as the absolute last flowering of a very special world. Flaming June's first owner, and this happened during Leighton's lifetime in June of 1895, was a man called William Lewson Thomas. He founded a magazine called The Graphic in 1860, which was designed to showcase the work of artists and writers who were prominent at that time, including Leighton. And you can see exactly why Lewson Thomas would have wanted to have this picture. He paid Leighton, by the way, something like £1,150 for it in the summer of 1895. But as I say, this is a perfect picture for a publisher to have. Flaming June is compact, it's dynamic, it's vibrant, and it's immediately recognizable. And I think this is a fact that I hope we'll see as we go on through time. But when Leighton sold this to Lewson Thomas and then died, Lewson Thomas made a plate, an electroplate print of it, which is, as you can see, faithful in a way, but really rather crude. And Lewson Thomas sold this as a special insert in the Christmas issue of his magazine the year that Leighton died. He also, by the way, hung the painting itself in the window of his offices, of the offices of the Graphic in Fleet Street, so that when the crowds left St. Paul's Cathedral for Leighton's funeral, they passed the Graphic offices and Leighton's masterpiece on their way back to the West End. So it was a very calculated move on the part of Lewson Thomas. But it was also, I would say, the beginning of Flaming June becoming an icon, because suddenly, instead of being a literally unique masterpiece in a rarefied setting, this is something that for 1 shilling, as you saw from the ad in the last slide, anybody could have and could put over their fireplace or wherever they wanted to. And suddenly it was an object of really popular consumption, I would say, for better and for worse. Flaming June's fortunes declined from there. She entered the collection of a brewing family called Watney and passed through several members of the family. And in 1915 was lent to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which you see here on the left, and on the right, an installation snapshot, which I took myself a few years ago when I was there. But these were and are the Victorian galleries at the Ashmolean. And there's a very telling anecdote from that time when the owner of the painting lent it to the keeper at the Ashmolean, who took it. His name was Mr. Bell, and he took the picture quite reluctantly. What happened was a guard noticed that there was a pigeon behind the canvas, a flaming June, stuck in the galleries. And the guard saw it and ran to Mr. Bell. And he said, Mr. Bell, there's a pigeon stuck behind Lord Leighton's canvas. And Mr. Bell said, is it dead, young man? And the guard ran back to check, and he ran back to Mr. Bell. He said, yes, it's dead. And Mr. Bell said, well, if it's dead, then it doesn't matter. And this really sums up the state of Victorian art, as far as I'm concerned, in about 1930. Flaming June's fortunes declined even further, I must say. In 1963, an Irish builder was demolishing a house in London and allegedly found the picture hidden behind a panel above a fireplace. He took it out and brought it to the local art establishment, which was a frame shop just down the road, which you see here on the left in a photograph from about that time, and sold it to the framer with its gold tabernacle frame for £60. Now, I think that story is a bit of a peddler's ploy, because I don't really think it was hidden behind a panel above a fireplace. I think it was most likely just covered up with a lot of other junk, as people would have thought at that time to do. And that was the state of Victorian art. I mean, if you think about the time of 1960, 1963, this is the age of David Hockney. It's the age of Andy Warhol in New York, Francis Bacon. And you can imagine just how far, really light years away, Leighton's world would have seemed to these people. But it wasn't that way for everybody. When the framer got it, he took Flaming June and put it in the window of his gallery, where, who of all people was passing by? Andrew Lloyd Webber with his grandmother. He was in his early teens, and he asked his grandmother if he could buy the picture. And the grandmother said, I will not have that Victorian junk in my flat. And that's how Andrew Lloyd Webber missed his chance. Of course, Andrew Lloyd Webber would become one of the most important collectors of Victorian art in the 20th century. And you see this photograph of him on the right, which I like this photo because behind him is a picture by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Fiammetta, the little flame, in other words. And so he got that idea, I think, never quite left him. He got the little flame, but he missed Flaming June. What happened to Flaming June was the framer actually sold the frame separately and then sold the canvas itself for £50 to a barber with a sideline selling pictures. The barber sold it to a private dealer, and the private dealer sold it to Jeremy Moss in 1964 for £1,000. Jeremy Moss was one of the real avant-garde of Victorian people in London, people who were reinvigorating Victorian art. You can imagine in the 60s, the beginnings of the Victorian Society in London, as well as John Betjeman, the mouthpiece of the organization, fighting to preserve historic buildings like St. Pancras Station a little later. And this was really still very much on the fringes. And I think this photo of the Moss Gallery around 1970 really shows how little these works were appreciated in a way, because on one wall of Jeremy Moss's gallery, you can see Leighton's masterpiece after masterpiece. I mean, pictures which would never be for sale today, let alone for sale on a single wall. And I can point out that in the middle center of this picture, you have a picture called Twixt Hope and Fear, which was actually one of Leighton's submissions in 1895 from that Show Sunday photograph. So what happened was Jeremy Moss got the picture and he proceeded to offer it to every museum in England that he could think of. And every museum in England that he could think of turned it down. He didn't know what to do, and a bit bereft, in June that year, 1964, he hung it on the wall of his gallery, probably the wall that you see here. And fate played its hand. A man from Puerto Rico called Luis Ferré came in by chance and saw the picture. Mr. Ferré later said that it was love at first sight. Now, Mr. Ferré is quite an extraordinary person. He was, as I say, from Puerto Rico, from the city of Ponce on the south coast of the island, a philanthropist. He would soon become the governor of Puerto Rico and later a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was also building, at just this time, a new museum, the Museo de Arte de Ponce, which would be a great landmark to all that he envisioned the island could be and do. And he was in Europe buying pictures specifically for the museum. So Mr. Ferré paid Jeremy Moss £2,000 for Flaming June. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but if you think about it, Mr. Lucian Thomas paid Leighton £1,150 50 years earlier. This was the highest price ever paid for a Leighton painting in over half a century. Mr. Ferré definitely was looking ahead. That night, I like this. I think in case you haven't noticed, Flaming June has a bit of magic around it. And that night, when Mr. Ferré bought the picture, Jeremy Moss opened the Evening Standard and he saw the headline that you see on the upper right, Flaming June will keep on flaming. To me, that says the climate at that moment. I mean, it's the weather report. It's not anything to do with the painting, but it shows that the climate for Victorian art was definitely changing. 5 years later, Moss was commissioned to write the first major monograph on Victorian art called Victorian Painters. And his publisher had one requirement, which was to have Flaming June on the cover. And no doubt the publisher's motivation was exactly the same as William Lucian Thomas's was half a century earlier, and probably the editor of Vogue half a century later. Flaming June is just a delicious, striking image, which almost levitates above the rest of Victorian art. And it was certainly true for this book because it ran into edition after edition and really became the textbook, the early textbook of a survey of Victorian art. So Flaming June crossed the Atlantic to Puerto Rico to a beautiful new building, which Luis Ferré was just in the process of finishing. And I think the building itself is sort of fabulous, and I just take a moment. It was created by Edward Durrell Stone, an American architect responsible for MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Kennedy Center in Washington, and many other important civic buildings. So this was very much a declaration that Puerto Rico was, on the one hand, yes, an island, but on the other hand, an island that was very much connected to the world. And Ferré was, as I say, very, very circumspect because he succeeded in collecting not just Flaming June, but really assembling what's probably the most important collection of British Victorian art outside the UK. And I just give you a little taste of the company, the extraordinary company that Flaming June is in. You can see three of Edward Burne-Jones's Briar Rose panels, which are as beautiful as anything in the world. And these also, I was looking at them this morning, and I thought, yes, people think of Burne-Jones as a pre-raphaelite, but what he really is an aesthetic artist. Because I don't know if you can see in this little slide, but if you look at the armor of the knight on the left I mean, nobody could ever go to battle in it. It's just delicious to look at. The only difference is Leighton chose a kind of classical aestheticism, and Burne-Jones aimed for a sort of homegrown Arthurian English version of it. Another great highlight in the museum's collection is the monumental 20-foot-long Sleep of King Arthur in Avalon. And I can't tell you all about it. I would love to. But for our purposes, what I find fascinating is that Mr. Ferré bought this picture at auction in London. It had an estimate, well, I don't remember what the estimate was, but it didn't even sell at that time. I think he ended up paying something around £2,000 for it, which, you know, basically the same price as Flaming June. And it's funny because at the time, this picture was held in such little esteem that it was carelessly hung on the wall at Christie's and fell off. And allegedly, one of Christie's specialists had to fight their way out from under the canvas. And this gives you an idea of really how these pictures were thought of by the public at large at that time and how it would change. Here's a fabulous painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, The Roman Widow. So lyrical and just extraordinary. And a painting by Frederic Sands, Isuda and the Love Filter. Totally, I put this one up first because I like it, but second because when you talk about the Museo de Arte de Ponce, it's really a flurry of activity in the early 60s of Mr. Ferré going to Europe and assiduously building a collection over, you know, a space of about 10 years, more or less, which is extraordinary when you think of the result. But I'm happy to say that the highly finished, beautiful pencil drawing by Sands on the right, obviously associated with this picture, was a recent acquisition to the museum, and I was honored to help them with it. This is a view of the gallery, which gives you just an idea of how big King Arthur and how monumental and how striking it is on the wall, along with the Rossetti and the Burne-Jones with Flaming June peeking around the corner. Finally, in a home which really is fitting for her. What, 50, 60 years later. So Flaming June really is just getting discovered over and over. And she's, as somebody said about Judy Garland once, she's the queen of the comebacks. And every time I go on Instagram or on the internet, I find a new Flaming June. And these were just some samples I took recently. We saw Jessica Chastain before. You can see Bernie Sanders on the lower left. I love that somebody did that. This is the point. People are used to having Flaming June in their lives, and they find ways of inserting her into them. And I think that says something. My other favorite is the smoked salmon on the right, because anything you ever needed to know about aestheticism, you can see from that smoked salmon. That sensuous, glistening S curve just sells it. I mean, everything you need to sell a painting, you need to sell a smoked salmon. So that makes me smile. And then, of course, the merchandise. I hasten to add, Flaming June is not in copyright, but it is, but when you see the extraordinary amount of stuff that you can get with Flaming June, it's really mind-boggling. And I think that people see these things and they don't even know the words Flaming June or Lord Leighton. They just see it as, say, a picture of Marilyn Monroe by Andy Warhol. It's just, the image has surpassed itself. I mean, I love it. Flaming June light switch covers, Flaming June neckties, mouse pads, t-shirts, mini skirts, baby onesies, pillboxes, coffee mugs, I love the shower curtain on the lower right, iPhone covers. I mean, it's sort of amazing how many times she's discovered and rediscovered daily from places far beyond England or Puerto Rico or anywhere. But I must say, there is a bit of serendipity and the feeling that she's very happy at home, because In the back of the painting, there are, beyond the sea that I was talking about earlier, there are these two lovely mountains, it's not mountains, islands silhouetted in the back of the sea. And there happened to be an island just off the coast of Ponce in Puerto Rico called La Caja de Muerto, the dead man's coffin, which look exactly like the ones in the picture. And it strikes me that, well, it's sort of fitting for a picture of a sleeper. And most of all, I think Flaming June is very happy in the sunshine after a long, unexpected, turbulent, wonderful, wonderful journey. So thank you so much. That's what I had to say about Flaming June. And I'm really delighted to turn the talk over to Simon Toll, my wonderful friend and brilliant brains behind the Victorian Art Department at Sotheby's, to tell us about some Leightons which are being rediscovered much more recently.
Patrick, how on earth am I going to follow that? And that was absolutely fantastic. And I think we all really learnt more about Flaming June. Flaming June is one of those pictures that I think Patrick can talk for hours about and it still be fascinating, because it really is the most wonderful picture. Patrick and I have known each other for a few years actually, and we did meet over Flaming June because Patrick came into Sotheby's asking about this wonderful drawing that I discovered. But I do have to sort of admit that it's not quite sort of an Indiana Jones sort of discovery. Quite often when you're at the coalface of somewhere like Sotheby's, discovering things is very exciting, but is sometimes a case of trawling through a whole contents of somebody's house, looking through lots of prints and things that have been stored in the attic and wonderful paintings that are on display. And you don't always know what you're going to go and find. And the picture that Patrick wanted to speak to me about was a little drawing about that big for Flaming June, the head study for Flaming June. Now, I knew this picture because I spend my weekends, as everybody does, I'm sure, flicking through copies of the Magazine of Art from 1880s. That's my kind of thing. And this picture had been reproduced in there. Now, when you work for an auction house, you're sent away on valuations and you don't know what you're going to see when you turn up at so sometimes very wonderful houses. So when I was asked to go and look at the collection of the late Duchess of Roxburgh, I was doing an insurance valuation, I should stress. I turned up at the house and was given a list of rooms and a list of possible things to look at. And I went around and there was one picture that was listed as a pencil drawing of a girl's head. And when I went into her bedroom, I could see it just in the corner of my eye. I could see it in the little sort of anteroom that led into her. It was sort of a dressing room, I suppose, that led into her bedroom. And I recognized it. It's the head study for Flaming June. Now, this might not seem very exciting, but I think when you have things like a drawing by Leighton that is for such a famous picture, and you know that his hand touched it, and it is just hanging in a very inconspicuous place on a valuation, it's really exciting. And of course, did the rest of the valuation and then had about 5 or 6 years where this picture had sort of kept coming into my mind, and I kept thinking about this picture. And then when we eventually did the sale of the contents of her house, this picture was sold. And that's how I met Patrick, because he was writing about Flaming June and wanted to know the story of how this picture was discovered. Now, we talk about pictures being lost, and of course, they're lost to us, but they're not lost to the people that own them. You know, most pictures are hung on someone's wall and somebody cherishes them, and they know what they are. It's Granny's painting by Leighton or whatever it is, but they're not lost to these people. So the Duchess of Roxburgh knew exactly where this drawing was, but it was a picture that she passed 4 or 5 times every day, and she probably didn't really look at it anymore. It was just one of her possessions. And that's the thing, pictures aren't lost, but they are lost to the public. And it's part of my job that's the most rewarding bit is when you're able to reveal a picture that hasn't been seen for years. And on the screen at the moment, which hopefully you can see, are two paintings which actually were lost for years. And again, as I say, they were hanging on people's walls and they were cherished, but we didn't know where they were. Perhaps we'll start with the one on the right, which is a picture called Mnemosyne. She's the goddess of memory. Now, this picture's had a very troubled past. I mean, it started off as being part of a decoration of a ceiling for the first director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Fabulous. This room was one of the most famous interiors in New York, and Leighton painted this incredible ceiling. I mean, now it would be considered so avant-garde. It was such an incredible ceiling. Now, when he died, the ceiling was on canvas, so it was removed, and actually the whole ceiling was separated into separate panels and then dispersed. So Mnemosyne actually ended up being a couple of other collections, and then faced the indignity of being in the dramatic hall of Croydon Gasworks. Now this, so I'm not mocking it, but it just shows that by the 1940s, Victorian art was considered so passé, really the sort of thing that you wouldn't possibly put on your wall, that a major painting by Leighton had ended up gracing the walls of the Amateur Dramatic Society of a gas company. Fortunately, more recently than that, it's been in a collection in Greece and has been loved, but is now being offered for sale. And it's wonderful to work with a picture like this, because this isn't a small picture. This isn't a picture this big. This is a 60-inch painting by Leighton. It's a big picture. Now, I would love to show you that picture, but it is too big. So what I do have is the other picture that I actually have coming up in a sale at the moment, which is the head of the girl, which you can see on the screen, but I also want to show it to you in the flesh, because I just happen to have it under my desk. Now, this is a picture that I was sent a photograph of by a colleague in France that had seen it in a private collection in Normandy, and they knew it was by Leighton, but they didn't know what it was worth, and they didn't know that it was a pretty much unrecorded picture. I'm going to pop it down because it's rather precious. So this picture on the back actually says that it's of an Italian girl. Now, I think that's actually not quite correct. I think she's actually a Greek girl. And I think this picture has perhaps been confused. I think there are two pictures, or one picture, I should say, with two records. I think the Greek girl and an Italian girl are actually the same picture. They're both listed in the catalogue raisonné, neither of them reproduced. So it's difficult to know whether they are the same picture, but it's such a lovely picture. This is actually coming up for sale at the moment. It's in London at Sotheby's, and we actually have just posted live our catalogue. Now, I don't want no hard sell here at all. This is to discuss Leighton and to celebrate his work. But if you'd like to read more about either of these two pictures, they are on our website. Please do have a look, have a read about them. And if we can help about them, do give me a call. I love to talk about Leighton, and I will talk for hours and hours if you let me. I'm now going to pass back to Daniel, who I think is going to open up for some questions. I see that we've got quite a few questions to get through. So yeah. Daniel, back to you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for that. I can see from the comments, everyone's very intrigued by what else you might have under your desk, but yeah. That's wonderful. So yes, so now is the Q&A time. So I think my colleague Anna will read out the questions that have been logged so far. I can see they've grown steeply. So Anna, over to you to ask those questions, and if they're specifically for one of us, obviously we'll address that, but if not, we may all chip in as the question requires.
Yes. Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for such an exciting and fascinating talk. Yes, indeed, there are so many questions and so many thank yous, and people really enjoy the talk. So I'm just sharing those positive and lovely comments as well. One question is about the frame of the painting that it was on display at Leighton House in 2016. And someone is asking whether that was the original frame separated from the painting in the 60s.
I love that somebody, is my mic on? Yes. Okay. Yes, I love that somebody asked that question. It's always the thing I forget to mention. And I always think no one's going to notice it, and somebody always does. What happens is that the original tabernacle frame with the columns on either side, etc., was when it went to the framers for sale in 1963, the framers sold the frame, but not the painting first. So when Jeremy Moss had it, he put sort of a more modest frame around it, and that's how it went to Puerto Rico. Then when Flaming June was lent, I believe, to the Royal Academy for the centenary of Leighton's death, Christie's contributed, and the framer Arnold Wiggins, the great framer in St. James's, recreated the frame based on the original black and white photograph. I hope that answers the question. Next question.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. There's another question, and I'm just gonna read it out. Is there any actual evidence as to what happened to Flaming June between her time at the Smolian in the 1930s and her re-emergence in a French shop in South London in the 1960s?
No, it's the paper trail goes absolutely cold. The owners at the time in the 30s had other Leighton pictures, which they sold at Christie's at the time, and Flaming June just disappeared. And I think that it's a hard thing for us to imagine today, but as Simon says about the gasworks, I think you don't notice something if you don't ascribe much value to it. And I think I love that Simon says that pictures don't really get lost. They just get unnoticed, sort of. So yes, I think it's just the trail totally goes cold.
Thank you. There is another very interesting question that says, how many other Leighton paintings do you think are still lost to the public?
That is a very good question, isn't it? I mean, Daniel probably knows, but there are probably only a handful, I would have thought. Yes, that is a very, very good question. I mean, smaller pictures are probably, there probably are those, but the large pictures are probably mainly accounted for. We have to remember that some of them probably haven't survived. There are pictures, Helios and Rhodos was destroyed by a flood, but there are other pictures that are lost. I'm trying to remember the name of Phryne. The large picture of Phryne, that's a large nude by Leighton that I think has been lost for a very long time. But as I say, there are pictures that are hanging in obscure places that aren't lost. They're just out of the eye of most people. There's Ariadne deserted by Theseus, which is in a collection in Hyderabad, which is not a very well-known Leighton, but to the people of Hyderabad, I'm sure they know that image very, very well. These things are hanging on someone's wall or hanging they're up in somebody's attic. They're just waiting to be seen again. They're not lost forever, hopefully.
I can add that there's even one drawing for Flaming June, which is still missing. Yeah. So be on the lookout. You may find it. Call me up.
And then call me.
I'll sign first, then call me.
There's another question here. I think it's for you, Simon. Someone is asking, what year is the head of the girl?
Sorry, yes, I should have said. So this picture, it's not dated. Leighton didn't always date and he didn't always sign his pictures, but it's not dated, but he did a whole series of these pictures, which are essentially aesthetic paintings. They have no subject really, a little bit like Flaming June. This Italian girl is a girl. She's not named. She's not of Campaspe. She's not of Andromache. She's just a girl. And he painted this series in the late 1870s. I think this picture is probably from 1876, 1877. And I think it probably is the Grosvenor Gallery exhibit of 1877.
Thank you. There is another question or comment or thought about the frame, and someone is wondering what the original frame could be. Any guesses?
It could have a mirror in it. It could have another painting in it. There are stories about frames like this one being melted down, being burnt to get the gold from them. I heard of a whole collection of frames being burnt in that way in the 1940s, simply to get the gold from the frames. So it may have survived. It may have a different incarnation now, but it would be fascinating if it ever was discovered.
It would be fantastic.
Yeah.
I don't think there are more questions. There are, as I say, so many comments of people just sharing their enthusiastic comments and thoughts about Flaming June and the stories that you have shared. I'm just gonna quickly go through the chat just in case I've missed any of the question. People just mentioning that they've got print copies of Flaming June and posters in their houses, which is a really nice image to share.
That's the thing, and that doesn't happen by chance. That whole process was carefully calculated over 120 odd years, from the time that the owner of the graphic magazine bought it to the time that Jeremy Moss put it on the cover of his survey book, to Vogue, and to on and on and on. This is images, and I don't even mean paintings, but I mean images of paintings have lives of their own. So it's a lovely thing, but it's not a surprise.
Absolutely. Daniel, I think I'm gonna, I think it's the last question from the chat. So yeah, over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to both you and Claudia for your organisation and promotion of this evening's talk. But of course, particular thanks to Simon and to Patrick for two wonderful insights into aspects of Leighton. And of course, anyone associated with Leighton House is very grateful that Leighton painted Flaming June, because it is a wonderful promotion and advertisement, and it's in people's, as Patrick has explained, it's in people's sort of consciousness. And it's wonderful for us to be able to make the link and link it to Leighton House. So thank you both very much. Thank you to Simon for resisting the promotion of his sale to the extent that he did, but all best wishes for that as well. And thank you all to everybody for joining. I know apparently there's something else happening this evening later on, which some of you may be waiting for. So I hope this evening was a good start to a successful night. Thank you very much.